Welcome to Joy at the Crossroads, a place where old stories take new shape and the past lingers just around the bend. I'm Joy, and here we dig up the tales that slip through the cracks, folklore, fables, and legends that still know how to speak. So settle in, let the world slow down, and let's walk through a story. Lookin for Three Fools. That gal Tildy Moore had had her heart set for John Spencer for near about a year. She had been dropping hints and side-eye looks all along, but John was young and skittish and didn't catch on fast. However, one bright May day in church, when he finally seen her kind of cutting her eyes toward him, he reared back and took notice. After church, when everybody was bunching around asking the Reverend to dinner and bragging to each other about their crops and just generally being sociable, John, he sashayed over to where Tildy was, prancing around her ma and a group of other women. "Might I have the pleasure of seeing you home, Miss Tildy?" he said, tipping his hat as clever as you please. "Why, John," Tildy giggled. "You'll have to ask Ma, but I wouldn't mind." Old Miss Moore was hard put to keep a straight face. She was that pleased, but she put on her solidest look and said, "Well, I reckon you can walk home with John, but don't y'all meander and dally on the way, for I'll be needing your help with supper." Well, the two of them strolled down the road to her house. 'Twasn't more than 2 miles. John pulled up a chair on the porch closest to where Old Man Moore was sitting, and they talked about this and that while the woman scraped up dinner. While she was setting the table, the old lady seen the syrup pitcher was near about dry, so she said, "Tildy, you run to the smokehouse and fetch some molasses." Tildy took the pitcher and went out to the smokehouse, and she stayed and stayed, and she stayed. Wasn't so long till her ma got right uneasy, so she called and she called, but Tildy didn't answer. So her ma throwed a cloth over the table to keep the flies off the victual, and she took and went to the smokehouse to see what the matter was. Where there sat Tildy by the molasses keg with her knees drawn up and her chin on her hands and the syrup just running over the edge of the pitcher and making a puddle on the dirt. "Well, my goodness, Tildy, whatever in the world got possession of you?" she yelled at the gal. Tildy lifted up her head and looked at her ma with bland, staring eyes. "Why, Ma, I was just thinking about whatever shall we name our first child when me and John get married." "Well, now, Tildy, I declare that is to be thought about," the old lady said, and she sat down in the puddle of molasses beside Tildy and put her hands on her knees and her chin on her hands and started helping her think. "Now, there's hardly a patient man to be found than Old Man Moore, but meal times when he was hungry was not one of them times. Him and John got to talking less and less, and he commenced to fidgeting worser and worser. Finally, he couldn't stand it no longer, so he took his feet off the banister and went stumping into the kitchen, and there he found a table all covered up, but no wife and no Tildy. He yelled out, "Ma, where you at?" When he didn't get no answer, he was mad enough to chew up sawdust and spit out scantlings. Then he looked out the back door and seen the smokehouse door open and got awful uneasy, thinking maybe they had both went out and got snake bit. He tore out down them back steps and went a-busting out to that smokehouse, like the devil, beating tan bark, and poked his head in the door. His eyes near bugged out. There sat Tildy and her ma with their hands on their knees and their chins on their hands, a-thinking, and the molasses was pouring out and a-making a regular lake. "Old woman, what on earth are you doing?" he hollered. Old Miss Moore raised her blank eyes over toward him and told him, "We're just trying to think up a name for the first child when John and Tildy get married," she said. That took the old man up short. He said, "Well, that is something to be thought up about." So he sat down in the molasses and began helping him think. Well, John liked to wore out the bottom of his pants fidgeting. He didn't know, should he go home or should he stay? Finally, he sat just as still as he could and strained his ears for a listen for them people. He didn't hear nothing. Well, it got to where he just couldn't hold himself in no longer. He had to know what the matter was, manners or no manners, so he went up to see if he could find him. He even hollered for the old man a time or two, but it had been Sunday. He wouldn't holler too loud. Finally, he seen the smokehouse door open, so he went out to peek a look, and there he found the whole Moore family just a-sitting half-leg deep in molasses with their hands on their knees and their chins on their hands, looking into space. John, he scratched his head and kicked his foot and said, "Excuse me, y'all, but did y'all get bad news?" Old Man Moore didn't as much raise his head. He told him, "We're thinking up a name for the first child when you and Tildy get married." Well, that fair took John's breath away for a minute, and he had said, "Well, I never. If that didn't be anything I ever seen, I bet I can go up this here road as far as it goes, and I'll never find 3 fools as big as y'all. If I do, I'll come back here and marry the gal." He didn't say no more, but he stuck his hat on his head and went off down the road. It was a powerful, thin, settled country up around there, and he had to walk a right smart piece before he had come to another house. This old house had boards covered in green moss stuff growing out thick all over him. Well, right out in the front yard was a man trying to drive an old skinny cow up the ladder that was leaning up against the house. John stopped dead for a spell, and he just gaped at the man. Finally, he made so bold to ask him, "Mister, I'm a stranger in these parts, but I sure would like to know what you're trying to do." The man, he worked his chew of tobacco over to one side of his mouth and spit at a horsefly and near about hit it. Then he said, "Why, I'm trying to get this here creature up there to eat that there moss off them shingles, but dang her country hat, looks like she'd rather starve plumb to death than to climb that there ladder." John asked him, "Well then, why don't you scrape that stuff off and let her eat it down here? Looks like if them rafters ain't strong enough to hold up her weight, she sure will ruin the top of your house." The old man, he reached down and got that cow by the tail, but before he twisted her, he turned around to John. He said, "Well, son, I've been pasturing my stock since your grandpa was no bigger than a ground puppy, and I reckon I can still pasture my cow without no advice from any of you soft-headed Spencers." And just with that, he twisted that critter's tail so hard that she ran up 9 rungs of the ladder and stood there swaying. Now John thought he might step up and fetch that old man a slap, but he was looking for fools, not for fights. So he went on with his hands in his pockets, a cussing and a hawking and a spitting, knowing he had found one fool. Along late in the evening, he came to the next house. It was after night, and the moon was a-shining when he seen it. And he seen something else which surprised him a heap. A woman was a-tearing around and around the house, pushing a wheelbarrow, and every time she made the 3rd trip around, she would shove the wheelbarrow inside the house and dump it. Then she skedaddled back out and run around again and again, and there wasn't anything in that barrel. Well, John, he watched and he watched, and he figured and he figured, and he couldn't make it out. Finally, he busted out as polite as he knew how. "Please, ma'am, might I ask what you doing?" She was a little woman and swift. "Son, I ain't got no time to be answering no foolish questions. Here I am, been scouring the floors all afternoon, and it ain't but 3 hours till moonset, with me still having to haul in enough moonshine to dry the parlor floors." And she just kept on a-going. John didn't have nothing at all to say to that. He just scratched his head and he went on off. And he said to himself, "Well, that sure makes 2." He was so wore out and hungry he didn't go on but just for a few miles further, until he laid under a tree with his coat for a pillow and slept till big daylight. Then he got up and went on. Just about sunup, he came around the bend in the road, and there sat a house. There wasn't nobody astern and no smoke coming out the chimney, but it looked like somebody must stay there, so he went to the door and knocked. He didn't get no answer, so he knocked again, but that time he heard a funny bumping noise toward the back side of the house, and being brash and young, he went around to see what that noise might be. Well, there was a man under the peach tree in the backyard. He didn't have a thing on but his shirt and drawers. His pants was hanging on the limb of the peach tree, and the airman would jump up as high as he could and kick the top of the breeches with both feet, and fall back and bump himself on the ground. That what was making the bumping noise. He'd get right back up and dust off where he had bumped himself and jump up and kick the breeches again. John was too weak to talk loud, but he spoke up as stout as he could and said, "Mister, might a poor stranger ask you what you're doing?" "I'm a-trying to put my breeches on, smart Alec. What does it look like I'm doing?" That made John sort of mad, and he said, "Well, why in the dickens don't you take 'em down from there and then step in 'em 1 foot at a time?" The man turned around and looked at John like he could go plumb through him. "Boy, this is how my pa and his pa before him put on their breeches, and what was good enough for them is sure good enough for me." Then he gave a peculiar hard jump and got 1 foot in the breeches, but fell. "Most had it that time," he said, but old John Spencer never heard him, for he was halfway back to Tildy's house by that time, 'cause he had sure enough found him 3 bigger fools than Tildy and her ma and pa. Thanks for stopping by Joy at the Crossroads, where every story leaves a little something behind. If you like what you heard, go ahead, like, share, and drop a comment. Let me know what tales you want to hear next. Until next time, keep your ears open and your stories close.